The first thing that capitalism selects for in its monarchs is just like any level of basic competence. So, the guy who is competent enough to become a Fortune 500 CEO of Chipotle, this guy is not going to be like this weird psychotic like poisoner. Maybe he won't be brilliant. Maybe he won't be Steve Jobs. Maybe he won't be Tim Cook, right? But the thing is, you could take probably 495th worst CEO in the Fortune 500 and you could put him in charge absolute sovereignty over San Francisco. And you would see a San Francisco that would just blow your mind as to how different and better it was. Imagine you're the CEO of Chipotle, okay, and you go crazy and you're like, okay, I'm going to put fentanyl in the burritos. I'm going to put just a little bit. Not going to screw up. It's going to be just going to render, it's like MSG, it's going to render them subtly more delicious. So I'm going to put fentanyl in the burritos. My sales are going to go up. Nobody knows why. And then everything is great. 6 months later, somebody makes a mistake with one of the bags, kills, 30,000 people with fentanyl-laced burritos. Is this something that could happen in reality? Is this something to be afraid of? Should we say, instead of this system, this is such a scary system, this is such a scary thing. Think about the amount of trust you're putting in someone when you let them prepare food for you. They can kill you just like this. They could put cancer-causing aflatoxins in that would, it would be totally untraceable. It's this immense, so are we safe from these CEOs? The answer is obviously no. And what we need instead is for the customers of Chipotle to elect, not just, even to elect a CEO that still smacks of corporate monarchism. No, they should, there should be checks and balances. There should be one body that checks the food to see how it tastes. We should separate testing the food for safety from taste verifying. We will need a body of elected representatives for each of them. People in Cincinnati might like the Chipotle burritos a little bit different from those in Denver. Perhaps we could even have direct democracy governing Chipotle, so the new flavors could be voted on by the customers, or actually the customers, but the customers will not just get to vote on flavors. No, they'll set the hours of the employees and they'll decide who to hire and fire. Because they want to have obviously people they like and people they trust serving them the burritos. You never know. Even an employee could be a poisoner. Anyone could poison these burritos, right? And so when you look at kind of this approach of first of all, this is an approach of like systematic, bizarre paranoia. And now you might say that, okay, all of these things would break the law. And like the federal government is standing by vigilantly with its like vigilant consumer regulatory apparatus. Consumerism was actually kind of in the mid-century, this kind of big quasi-communist cause. It's very weird. It's like people subscribe to like Consumer Reports because their like family is progressive. But today we've had an interesting experiment in the regulatory state, which is that we basically turned Amazon into Alibaba. And right now you can go on Amazon and find some weird thing with a weird brand name like Kapunk or Queeg. Have you heard of these products off of Amazon? The Queegs, or whatever. And like totally unbranded products, regulated by no one. I think in some cases they may actually be shipped directly from China, and nobody there cares at all, basically. And things are basically fine. And so these people are utterly mercenary and motivated entirely by money. And entirely by like short-term, money. So if you basically look at, okay, why does the system work as well as it works? It is not because it is being vigilantly regulated. The first thing that basically capitalism selects for in its monarchs is just like any level of basic competence. So, the like guy who is competent enough to become a Fortune 500 CEO of Chipotle, this guy is not going to be like this weird psychotic like poisoner. Maybe
Right.
Maybe he won't be brilliant. Maybe he won't be Steve Jobs. Maybe he won't be Tim Cook, right? But the thing is, you could take probably 495th worst CEO in the Fortune 500, and you could put him in charge, absolute sovereignty over San Francisco. And you would see a San Francisco that would just blow your mind as to how different and better it was. And you take the 500th. Let's take number 500. This guy's drunk all day, right? He's still going to do a better job than this insane system you came up with when you were paranoid about fentanyl in the burritos. So that's basically how I regard what we're doing today. Now, get out there and vote, and grill yourself a nice steak afterward.
Angel, any issues with this?
I don't know. I mean, it's a lot to take in, I guess. I don't know. It's,
I could name a couple of issues, but I want you to answer first, Angel. Let me know what you think.
Well, I mean, there are definitely problems with the system, and there are definitely ways that people can introduce fuckery into the system because the system's not perfect. But I would say it's a pretty ingenious system, and for all its flaws, I tend to agree with, I think, was it Churchill who said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
So if you make a quadrant of people who believe, I think that Churchill was exactly right, but maybe not in a way that I think that, I'm not sure if Churchill said that. It may be an apocryphal quote, but
yeah, it might be.
That's been attributed to a lot of people. So, but if you make a little quadrant about, and it's true in a sense. So there are three forms of government, as Aristotle, taught us: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. The rule of one, the rule of the many, of the few, and the rule of the many. Mm-hmm. And these forms will frequently masquerade as each other. So there's like a symbolic monarchy, for example, in the UK right now. Today, everybody kind of knows that Charles III isn't really the king, that he's just this kind of actor who wears king clothes, that he's not like Henry VIII, and being a functional unit of government. Right. At one time, this deception was actually meaningful and useful. So if you basically look at the way I sort of grew up inside what you might call the deep state, my dad was at the State Department. My mom was at DOE, and my stepdad was on the Hill for many years and now teaches at Hopkins SAIS. And, one of the things that you can observe if you look at the federal government is you say, well, in what sense is this a democratic system? And you're looking to work that through from first principles. And one of the reasons you're looking to work that through from first principles is that essentially, if you think about what the word democratic means in our world today, it means legitimate. So essentially, an undemocratic government is one that is defined as illegitimate. So, for example, if you look at, there's a country whose formal name is the DPRK. That's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's three euphemisms for democracy and one place name, and that's, of course, North Korea. Mm-hmm. So, if you're North Korean, if you're in North Korea, you might want to be kind of fighting back against this tendency, and you might want to say, in what way is our DPRK democratic or people's or a republic? And because, again, these forms frequently masquerade as each other. And what you'll find is that you will almost always find some kind of defeat mechanism on democracy. You will almost always find that the wires in some way are not hooked up. There is a reason for this, which is that actual democracy, as opposed to, the very, very useful pretensive democracy, is a terrible system of government. It's almost never existed. It's almost never worked. It can be useful as kind of a momentary force in transitioning power from one responsible body to another. Historically, the choice is monarchy or oligarchy. Monarchy is much more common, and as even someone like David Hume thought.
What exactly? What exactly is it that you're proposing?
What is monarchy?
America and
yeah. So if you look at the defeat mechanism in today. If you look at our system of government, for which basically claims to be democracy, and which I assert is actually an oligarchy, and and you say, okay, we have a formal mechanism of government that is not actually operational. So, for example, what is the defeat mechanism that prevents Charles III from exercising the full powers of Henry VIII? It's not really anything in the law. It's just like, well, by custom, his royal prerogative is handled by, the prime minister. And it's custom because that's the way we've always done it, basically, I guess. It's a tradition. It's not even on paper. And, you'll constantly
there are a few
see
other
people
reasons
that,
why Charles wouldn't be able to seize power right now if he decided he wanted to do that.
What are those reasons?
I mean, I don't think anybody would listen to him. I don't think anybody would do it.
Really? Are you sure?
If he just decided, you know what, I want to actually become king of England right now.
Sure.
I want to take full control of Parliament and just handle that whole thing.
So
you would need a few people to start murdering some other people.
Let's
who's going to decide to do that and why, and
people assume that the sort of the love of the population for its system of government is very great, because in the past it has been very great, but in the present, I would say it's really not particularly great at all.
Part of the problem that I'm hearing and part of the problem I'm seeing is kind of the way that people treat this stuff and think about this stuff. So when we talk about presidential elections, we're going to have another one soon. And the way people talk about electing a president and the things that they expect a president to do or get done during their term, all the ways that we talk about it, all the ways that we think about it, all the ways that we argue about it, seems to me to betray that we feel as though we're electing a king or a queen.
Exactly.
God. But we're
exactly.
not.
But we're not. We're not. And there's something maybe slightly Orwellian about that. Rather than, I was fixing my audio. I was fixing my audio, and you figured out where I was going next, right?
Wait, but Curtis, I just want to make sure, Angel, I want to make sure I give you enough time to finish the statement. And don't worry, Curtis, we are going to go right back to you. But yeah, Angel, go on.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's all the Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and stuff, but but I think that's a problem. I think that mindset is a problem, because that's not what we're doing, and that's not what we should do, right? We should understand where we're coming from and what we're actually doing and how this actually works. And I think part of the reason why our system is and can be so dysfunctional is because there's a lot of responsibility placed on us individually and collectively to understand it and to participate in it intelligently. And that's not something that we tend to do. I don't think that, and I'm not putting words in Curtis's mouth necessarily, but I don't think that the solution to that is to then change the game altogether and remove that as an option. I think the answer is to do what we can to help people interact more intelligently with the system that we have, because when it is interacted with intelligently, it is better than what I can imagine and what I think history can tell us about, giving one dude the authority to kind of run things, right? The benevolence never seems to last very long, even in a benevolent dictatorship, or, if you want to call it the CEO of America or whatever you want to say. Even if that guy is perfect, right? So I'll bring this up. There's this awesome comic book called Red Sun. And it's basically a kind of, what if parallel universe story where Superman's rocket ship lands in the Soviet Union instead of in Kansas in the United States, right? So it lands in the Soviet Union, and like, what happens to this god, basically, this god alien who looks like a human when he's been brought up in the USSR, right? And it's a fascinating book. It's really
this
interesting.
It's not actually Soviet. This is post-Soviet. This is like
I can't remember exactly, but it's the Soviet Union or communist Russia. But he's brought up there, and the interesting bits are that he's still Superman, right? In the sense that he still is sort of compulsively dedicated to helping people, and that's his intention. That's what he's trying to do. But because of his upbringing, because of the different framework that he's been brought up in, he has a different way of going about that. And what he ends up being is a benevolent dictator. What he ends up being is, this force from the sky who imposes martial law and has the will and or has the you know the benefit of the people in mind, but still ends up being this terrifying oppressive force that everyone is scared of and everyone secretly hates but is terrified to say anything about. And spoiler alert, but like part of what happens in the story is that he begins to recognize this, and he realizes, oh, I'm going about this the wrong way. I'm basically torturing and oppressing people for their own good, and nobody likes it, and nobody feels that I'm giving them the thing that I'm trying to give them. So I need to rethink this. Right now, of course, you could write the story a zillion different ways if you were the writer, but I think that's a fascinating way of thinking about this particular thing. That's Superman, right? That's like the greatest person ever, right? There's nothing bad about him. He's pure and good to the core. But even that person in that circumstance will still become an oppressive force. And we couldn't hope to be as good as that. And the next guy and the next guy and the next guy,
So I think that when you look at the way you think about monarchy and the way most people in our society think about monarchy, it's also very, very affected by that same bubble effect, which is kind of like a fisheye lens in which, history since 1900 seems to be about 85% of history. And before, the 19th century is maybe another 10%. And then you've got 5% after that. And then it, dwindles off pretty well to the invisible. So it's kind of, it would be, to ask you basically how this perspective applied to Louis XIV, or Frederick the Great, or Caesar, or, any number of Chinese emperors would be. It's a sort of strange analysis to have in your head in a world in which, first of all, essentially what we're talking about, just to make it convenient, is kind of, the quarter millennium since the American Revolution. If you want to be really generous, you can throw the English Civil War and even, the wars of religion into that. But you're talking about a revolutionary period that has sort of worsened and worsened. And in particular, when you talk about European history, which, like it or not, is the center of the historical world in the period since the start of the 19th century, you're essentially, when you look at the quote dictators in the period since 1800, you're essentially looking at a series of rebellions against what was originally the balance of power and was later the British Empire, and which we now call the international community. There is no point of discontinuity in sort of the Anglo-American regime across these 2 centuries. It's just a sort of the balance of power shifts. One of the inevitable results of this is that essentially every regime on the planet, certainly since 1945, but arguably well before 1945, is faced, by this relatively unattractive choice of either becoming a puppet state or resisting the power around it. And it's the ability to resist the power around it grows weaker and weaker, more through soft power than through hard power, as to witness the utterly bizarre sight of the global George Floyd, movement in 2020. There are no countries anymore once this happens, right? And the maybe there were no George Floyd protests in North Korea, so North Korea is its own country, right? You have no barriers to soft power, certainly. And so essentially any country that is not part of the set is essentially a rebellion against this set. In order to consider rebelling at all, it needs to acquire the most effective, certainly in a military context, form of government, which is, again, simply a monarchy. I mean, obviously, there's a reason. If you drive a car, it was made by a monarchy. If you go to a restaurant, there's a chef. If you go to a movie, there's a director. Like, sort of everything that works is run by a monarchy. Well, the same is no different for a rebellion. So when you're basically looking at these rebellions and the various sort of kind of ghastly things that happen in these rebellions, what you're observing is that these are nations at war. And so, for example, it's not, wrong to attribute, to say that there's a deep connection between the Holocaust and Nazi ideology and the kind of union of democratic and monarchical power that Hitler represented. And it is not even wrong to say that the same kinds of people who voted for Hitler were the kinds of people who voted for Trump. It's the petty bourgeoisie. This is just a sociological, historical fact. It's as real as the Holocaust itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so, when you look at these things, sort of the liberal criticism of them is not wrong. But when you basically say, well, what is different between Henry VIII and Hitler? Well, Henry VIII maybe killed, 7, 10, 12, 15, 20 people who didn't need killing, saying, hey, wow, I'm evaluating this abstraction, which is true of every period in history. These are things that have nothing to do with kind of the rise of technology. I mean, the ancient Greeks had democracy too, right? They had no technology. And so when you basically look at, Hitler and even Stalin, and it really bears reminding, by the way, that when my grandparents were into Stalin in 1935, the set of atrocities that had been perpetrated in the Soviet Union was easily 2 orders of magnitude above anything that had happened in the Third Reich. Now, that had longer to get started, but yeah, right. So, and the thing is, even, what's going on in the 30s with American communists and Stalin, this is a really big digression, but they didn't view Stalin as a competitor. They didn't view themselves as traitors when working with Stalin. They viewed Stalin as like a kind of basically loyal satellite. Okay, maybe his methods are a little bit rough, so they were very surprised to find it a pure competition after World War II. But, again, and there you see, atrocities committed by these dictators. But you have to bear in mind that Stalin is enormously enabled in certain ways, and Hitler is enabled in other ways by the United States. And so, the thing is, all these forms of government emerge from the 20th century with their hands quite bloody. And, certainly the firebombing of cities served no useful military purpose. And that was established immediately after the war, not to mention the nuclear bombs. And so, you can't say, first of all, atrocities are always more likely from the loser and the underdog. And secondly, we have plenty of atrocities to go around, and we have plenty of, connivance with atrocities. So in any case, basically, like this argument is sort of by no means kind of clear or one-sided. It's limited in time. You can put it in a historical context, and you can kind of explain how, Augustus Caesar would be relatively unconvinced by this argument, because he would clearly see these monarchical rebellions as fundamentally an epiphenomenon of this kind of revolutionary attempt to revolutionize the earth, which is already implicit in the American founding, is that universal, that sense of the United States as a seed of universal revolution.
And I was thinking, as you were speaking about, you mentioned this kind of the Overton bubble and the way that our historical bubble only goes back a certain amount of time, and that leaves a lot out, right? And I'm thinking, well, even if we go back 2,000 years, there's a ton that is left out. Sure. Because you only get to hear from certain people, right? There's a reason why, in my view, most of our media and entertainment that revolves around this sort of stuff tends, like, there's a reason why there's a Netflix show called The Crown about the royal family, the English royal family, and there isn't really a show called, like, The Paupers, and it's about just some random fucking bunch of people who are super poor and they eat breadcrumbs, right? Because nobody wants to watch that shit because it's not interesting. There's a reason why Shakespeare wrote about kings. It's because everyone knows who they are, and they're obviously going to be more interesting because their day-to-day lives don't just include don't die.
And they also matter
right?
more.
And, so there's that, right? And I think that when we're looking at, what it was like under Louis XIV, we're not really going to know, because the vast majority of people who were living under that time did not have any kind of way of expressing whatever their desires were. But we do know, generally speaking, that there's a tension in human nature. There's this tension, right? There's one tension is kind of what we talked about, where people gravitate towards strong men and strong leader types, right? It's very easy for humans to get enamored with that. When there's a group of people in some kind of situation, a leader just kind of sort of presents himself. Like someone just decides to start taking charge and everyone else just kind of decides to follow them, right? That just happens naturally. I've been in so many group settings, like even something as stupid as like an escape room, right? There's 15 people in this stupid room and they have to solve a puzzle to get out. Suddenly somebody just becomes the guy or the girl that everyone's listening to. The first one is that, right? That's a human sort of tendency people have, like, just, it's kind of like dogs. Like, I need to know who the alpha is. Like, let me just figure out who's leading this pack so I can just go with the flow. There's that aspect to human nature, and it is in direct tension with this other aspect of human nature, which is I don't like anybody's boot on my neck. I don't like anybody telling me what to do. I want freedom and autonomy. And those two things are constantly in tension. And what we're doing in history is basically pulling, it's a tug of war between those two tensions. That's the way that I see it. And sometimes one side gets a lot of rope and sometimes the other side gets a lot of rope. And that's what revolutions are and all that sort of stuff. That's the way I look at it anyway. And I think that's inevitable. Now, the question then becomes, well, what's the best system that sort of satisfies both of those things? And in my view, so far, I think any kind of oligarchy or monarchy is too much rope to one side, right? And then, you get crony capitalism, you get all this stuff with the way that our current system is functioning or not functioning, right? There are plenty of problems. So it's not in any way to say that it's perfect. But I do think that the exercise of choice, the exercise of, electing representatives who then become the leader that you follow, and electing these people who then become people who sort of do the work and take the lead, and then you follow them in that way, seems to balance things in a way that works better, right? Better at the very least than one guy who just has absolute power and you just kind of hope for his benevolence and strength, right? Like, so Putin's weak. If he were stronger, it'd be better. I don't think so. I think he would just be an even worse scumbag. But that's just me. I don't know.
So let me I had a couple of notes as you were speaking. One, your point about the escape room is very well founded, which is that in order to execute anything, humans need to focus their efforts so that they're all pulling on the breadcrumb in the same direction. And the way that they will instinctively do that at scales large or small is that they will form structures with unequal levels of power. That is absolutely normal and instant. So the thing is, supposing that you were designing an escape room that you didn't want people to be able to escape from, one of the things that you would do is you would naturally suppress the ability to do that. And you would essentially say, okay, if they can't choose a leader, if they automatically choose a leader when trying to get out, if we prevent them from choosing a leader, perhaps we can keep them in. And so, for example, when the Romans would conquer, a people, actually eliminating the monarchies of the tribes and, barbarian kingdoms they conquered was a top priority. They're like, we get rid of Vercingetorix, the Gauls have no way to focus their efforts. Right. And so actually, if you want to basically disempower a people, that's exactly what you do. And you notice you're like, why, is part of the official ideology of the revolution this extreme fear of monarchical organization? Why, yes, it is. It's sort of like, saying, well, if we had a bacterium that replicated in cats by having them eat mice, we would expect it to make the mice very friendly to cats. And indeed, that's exactly what toxoplasmosis does. And so, we have a sense that maybe this is what, Marxists call a false consciousness, where it's something that or what Gaetano Mosca calls a political formula from the Machiavellians, nicely summarized in James Burnham's book, where it's like, this is a belief that basically corresponds to the belief that the powers that be are good and should rule us for our good. And to actually mask the belief that the powers that be should continue to be in the form of the people have power is a very, very interesting Orwellian structure. So going back to basically the defeat devices on the system, my YouTube forbidden question about elections, if you basically say, okay, suppose we want to present the appearance of a system that looks like this, but the system that actually works like this is really, really scary. What do we do? Well, one thing we could put in our ideology is we could put this interesting distinction in there between politics and democracy. Think about the word democracy and notice its positive context. Democratizing anything is good. Now think about the word politics and note its negative connotations. Anything is political bad. That's political is bad. This is very funny because these things are synonyms. What is democracy without politics? I don't know. Ask Kim Jong-un. You know, there must be, you know, and so you're like, wait a second. And then you're like, you notice that this is a very, very deep kind of bias in, or sort of deeply held belief in the American way of thinking.
I don't think they're synonymous in this context, right? I think when people think democracy, they're thinking, oh, well, you know, one person, one vote.
Suppose there were no elections,
many, right? That's what they're thinking. And then when you think
there were no elections, is it still democracy? If there are no elections, can you have democracy without elections?
Without elections?
Yeah.
I don't think so. No.
Okay, great.
Point,
so,
right?
So that's the whole point. So basically, so let's say we want to have elections in theory, but not elections in fact. What we're going to do then is we're going to basically design systems that elect politicians who are not actually in control of the government. So this idea of basically depoliticizing the government and making it sort of neutral governance of experts is actually not something that dates to 2012, more like 1912. It's a very, very deep and old part of the American progressive movement to basically, you know, in like 1900, when like William McKinley is president, the idea that professors are like dictating like public policy is unheard of. It would be like saying, oh, well, bloggers are going to run the government in 2032. Like this idea that basically democracy is good, but actually that doesn't mean having the people you elect have control of the government. Oh no, we mean democracy in this higher, more spiritual sense that doesn't equate to giving the people we elect control of the government. And in just the same sense,
that is what people think, though. I think that is
what people think. And so, but the thing is that thinking does not in any way coincide to reality.
So you're saying that's not actually what happens. What you're saying
that's not actually what happens. And
the
so
people we elect to represent us do not then
control
work
the government.
to
do not control the government,
enact law and all that sort of stuff.
No, they don't control the government at all.
So how is it working then?
So the way it works is if you go to DC, you will notice that there's something that's called the executive branch. If you look at the executive branch objectively, and I would encourage you to do this to anyone, you know, try this test on anyone who works on the Hill. Say to them, actually, we don't have an executive branch. What we have is a legislative branch. Why do we have a legislative branch rather than an executive branch? We have a legislative branch because the policy, structure, personnel, and funding of this branch, of the agencies, is dictated not by the White House, but by Congress. They testify before Congress. Agency officials testify before Congress. They don't testify at the White House. And in fact, if you basically tell, you know, anyone in DC that the executive branch as a whole would in fact not only work, but actually work better without the White House, everyone will agree with you. Now, they might protest that without a White House, there's no way to resolve interagency conflicts, for example, between state and DOD on areas of overlapping responsibility. This is true, but it can be solved, you know, for $9.49 by something you can buy at any Walgreens, which is a magic 8-ball. If you have an international interagency conflict, just shake your magic 8-ball and it will say yes or no or answer in clear, ask again later. Right. And so actually,
I don't know. We have both of those branches. We have the legislative.
Okay. So now
right?
Now let's go over to the legislative branch. So if we look at the executive branch, we notice that the wires between the White House and the agencies are not quite as disconnected as the wires between Charles III and the British Army, the Royal Army, but pretty close. And when we look at the history of the Trump administration, I just bought this book by this guy, David Rothkopf, called American Resistance, How the Deep State Saved the Nation. Rothkopf is, his own podcast is called Deep State Radio. He's kind of this.
I should bring him on the stream.
You should. That would be super fun. I don't think you do it. And especially not after I write what I'm going to write. And I summarize in this review I'm writing of his book, I summarize his argument as follows. Number one, there is no deep state. Number two, the deep state is more powerful than the president. Number three, the deep state is actually good. Number four, there is no deep state. And so, that's the level of like straight up O'Brien from 1984, like level of like confusion by which we've ruled. Now you might say, okay, maybe the executive branch is really part of the legislative branch. Where's the harm in that? The legislative branch is elected too. Well, it is. Except that you might notice that if you look at the House of Representatives, it has a 98% incumbency rate. If you look at the Senate, it's about a 90+% incumbency rate. Moreover, it has a system of seniority, which is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution, which forces freshmen into a position of complete and utter submission to essentially the permanent Hill staff, who then liaise with and direct the agencies. Public policy, none of this is mentioned in this piece of paper in a glass case somewhere, by the way. Public policy, to the extent that government decisions are taken by this system, it comes from basically these giant omnibus bills, which are called laws, even though they resemble a law about as much as an elephant resembles a rabbit, that are not even seen by the lawmakers who vote on them in this so-called parliament in which no vestige of actual parliamentary debate remains. In a system and where you look at actually when government decisions are made, when course is actually changed in this system, it comes from two places. It comes from what we call lobbyists and what we call activists. Lobbyists are people who are there to corrupt it for money, and activists are people who are there to corrupt it for power. Corrupt is a strong word to use. Maybe often improve it. Maybe many of these people are there to do the right thing. Influence it. There you go. Influence it. Thank you. I don't want to sound like a crank here. And the
I was about to say, so, you sound like you buy red yarn in bulk.
Yeah, right. And so when you look at the system, then you have the third branch, the judiciary branch. Oh wait, that one's not even supposed to be democratic. And so when you're looking at the system, this is why basically I'm like, the choice is not between monarchy and democracy. The choice is between monarchy and oligarchy. Democracy is not a valid way to run a country. It is a valid form of force that can be used by basically mob violence to change governments, or elections to change governments sometimes. More often the elections are almost always illusory. And when they're not illusory, they're very scary affairs. I don't know if you've seen a third world election, but like that.
We're seeing it now with Brazil, yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's a real, but even there, look at how much Bolsonaro changed the course of Brazil while he was president. It's the same place. It hasn't really changed. When you look at how much, Hitler changed Germany or FDR changed America, even, you see enormous changes. People who are afraid of, monarchy, I'm like, what do you think FDR was? What do you think Churchill was? They didn't wear a golden crown like they'd just been to Burger King, and so when we sort of follow the lessons of the Machiavellians and we kind of look at the realities rather than sort of talking in these abstractions, we often find that the realities are much simpler to see and understand than the abstractions. We can actually grapple with.
I don't think it makes any sense to equate FDR and Churchill to Hitler.
They're both in control of
FDR, yes. Churchill, no. I just don't think that Churchill.
Way, I mean, it's
FDR was
the thing is look at the circular reasoning that you're performing. You're defining dictators as bad, and then you say anyone who's not bad but is a dictator is not a dictator. And then I'm
not at all. But I think it's markedly different.
Is
what was going on?
I would just question real quick though. I would question with Churchill, because Churchill, after the war, he was not reelected. If we're talking about FDR, they did want him to keep going like that pink rabbit, but luckily he bought the farm, and we did not end up having what could have been a very bad situation in the United States. So with Churchill, I disagree. With FDR, I do kind of agree.
Plenty of dictators have given up power, and certainly Churchill during the war. What you're saying is that Churchill had a nobler spirit and did not choose to be dictator for life. This is true. On the other hand, Churchill's independence of FDR can be somewhat questioned. And there's a lot that we don't know about World War II simply because FDR did so much personally. And, if we look at our understanding of just historical understanding of World War II, we understand the Third Reich almost perfectly. Go to any historian, buy a major book, they'll disagree about a little thing, but it's just so clear and vivid as if it was under glass. We understand the Soviet Union much less than we understand. There are still real mysteries about Stalin's Russia. And but as far as FDR's Washington, it's terra incognita. It's almost all the histories we have are very biased sort of political propaganda or just uncritical hagiography.
Hold on, though. Going back to Churchill, though, if he were to say, you know what, guys, I'm going to stay here for life, you're not going to be able to do a damn thing about it, what would happen then?
Well, it's unclear. So in any, there's what Bruno Bueno de Mesquita, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita calls the selectorate in any power system. And so the thing is, when we look at Churchill's kind of rise to office, we don't, that is a time when you look at the first half of the 20th century, conspiracy theories in general are much more valid than those in the second half of the 20th century. We see people like Cecil Rhodes or Colonel House who operated in this very conspiratorial way in which personal power really mattered. That's not so much a thing, excluding proximal origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's not so much a thing, if you know that paper.
YouTube. We're still on YouTube.
That's it's just the lab leak. Can you do lab leak on YouTube these days, or is it not?
Oh God, I don't even know, Curtis. I'm just
I'm sorry. I'm
being
sorry.
on the straight and narrow.
I don't want to get you in trouble here. No,
if you don't want to get me in trouble, patreon.com/break the rules. Become a patron today if you want more of these amazing conversations.
Today. Support this great show. This has been super fun. And so when we look at that period of time, things are very mysterious. And so Churchill clearly has backers. There's this sense of, there's this interesting historian called Carroll Quigley, who is an establishment pillar. He writes this strange thing about, I've been examining the files of the secret society that controls the world. And, I'm going to write about them, even though I'm not going to say who they are.
Clinton's mentor.
Yeah, Clinton. So it is certain that the world is no longer governed this way. Okay, the world is not. I want to be very, very clear. The world in even in 1975 is not governed by secret. 1965 is not like this. 1935. It's moreover, it's more. It's not like the sort of power of these small groups, disappears if they're defeated. It's more like it kind of spreads out and kind of becomes nothing. So really, the question you ask is an interesting one, and I really don't know the answer, and I don't know that anyone could reliably tell you the answer. But to say, basically, I will tell you one thing that I know with every bone in my body, which is that World War II was not a Marvel movie and should not be understood as a Marvel movie. Furthermore, I would say that the current war in the Ukraine is not a Marvel movie and should not be understood as a Marvel movie. So, you have to basically, when you find a worldview like, the kinds of objections to dictatorship that you've been giving me, in which a lot of the stories really have that kind of Marvel movie sound to it, and can be contextualized in ways that require taking perspectives that are outside of this this Overton bubble, but in those perspectives, things that really look three-dimensional from within the bubble start to look two-dimensional, kind of like, the silhouette images, in front of the screen in Plato's cave. And so, one of the main reasons to kind of read old books and read strange books, especially anything published before 1923, except a very narrow stream of content, is going to be far right. And so by any definition, yours or your critics. And so, the thing is, taking a position, sort of taking a stance or a perspective that is outside of this bubble doesn't necessarily involve becoming far right. Moreover, far right to me, it's a term like Gentile. It just means everything else. I'm partly Jewish, I guess, but if I'm in Utah, I'm a Gentile. If a Hindu is in Utah, he's a Gentile, right? Because Mormons use the term too. And so you're basically, when you kind of say Gentiles are like this, Gentiles are like that, Gentiles do these things, Gentiles do those things, that kind of statement is not even wrong by definition, because you're lumping together Hindus and Jews. And, so it's a sort of, it's a fundamentally and inherently kind of meaningless way to think, in that you're basically creating a false category. And if you're able to basically read, even the Machiavellians is so great, because it's written, Burnham is writing in the mid 20th century, 1940 or whatever. He's writing for basically an essentially modern audience, but he's bringing you this stuff from what's called the Italian elitist school of political philosophy, pre-World War I mostly, and sort of just outside the range of that bubble. And you step into that, and then you can kind of step to there from de Maistre, or you can start treating like Hobbes with respect. A lot of people still read Hobbes. You can kind of step off the mainstream platform.
The radicalization pipeline.
You start to look, we don't know, so YouTube, nothing to see here, move along, and you can start to kind of move into that terra incognita beyond this bubble of the present. And it's like seeing the whole present, this whole revolutionary period, as a single unity in a larger history. It's like seeing the Earth from a satellite. It's like, that's the only way, if before people went into space, that view had never been seen.
I want to make sure Angel gets to respond, because Angel, you have to go pretty... No problem. Angel, you have to go pretty soon. But before that, I want to do a quick response as well. I do find that there is a bit of seduction where, especially a lot of people on 4chan, for instance, and in other places, where it almost feels like, because of the marvelization of society when it comes to how certain events are portrayed, people tend to get too seduced into going completely the other way and assuming that anything at all that's been marvelized, this is automatically the wrong way to look at it, so I'm going to go for the other side. And that, I think, is very shallow.
I'm going to root for the villain, and I'm going to root for the villain. And if you do that, you have not escaped from the frame.
Exactly.
Angel, please.
I think it's unfair to put this on Marvel, because people have been doing what you're talking about since long before that.
Indeed. And I did not mean to put Marvel.
It's just called propaganda. It's just called, my side bias or whatever. And that's what that is. And, people like their narratives, and they like their narratives really clear cut when it comes to, their ideological positions or their historical positions. And I think, obviously taking a broad view of history and how it's worked is important. I think it's just as important to take a broad view of human nature and how it has worked and how it does work. And my contention is that human nature is such that something like that simply would not work for very long without immense amounts of bloodshed. And by this, I mean, some kind of monarchical system. I just think, especially now that people, if you tried to implement this tomorrow, it would be a shit show, right? Because people already know what it's like to not be like that.